What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected legends sits down for what should be a friendly chat, only to face disrespect so shocking that it ends with him walking off set? In just 34 seconds, Jimmy Kimmel destroyed any chance of saving the interview with a comment so outrageous that Harrison Ford had no choice but to stand up and leave. Harrison Ford walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set that evening, expecting a normal conversation. The audience cheered as he made his way to the guest chair, waving politely before sitting down. Jimmy Kimmel greeted him with his usual smile, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. They talked about the weather, about Los Angeles traffic, small talk that audiences are used to hearing. But then, something shifted. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk spreading across his face. "So Harrison," he began, "I've been thinking about your career lately, and I have to ask, when was the last time you were actually in a good movie?" The audience went quiet. You could hear the uncomfortable shuffling in the seats. Harrison's expression didn't change much, but there was a tightness around his eyes that wasn't there before. "I think I've been fortunate to work on several good films," Harrison replied calmly, his voice steady and professional. Jimmy laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "Come on, be honest with yourself. I mean, we're all thinking it. You've been coasting on Star Wars and Indiana Jones for what, 40 years now? What have you really done lately that matters?" The audience gasped. A few people booed, but Jimmy just waved them off like their reaction was ridiculous. Harrison sat up a little straighter. "I've worked with talented directors and actors on projects I'm proud of. I don't think I need to defend my choices to you or anyone else." "See, that's the thing," Jimmy continued, ignoring the growing tension in the room. "You always give these grumpy old man answers. It's like you don't even want to be here. Why did you even agree to come on the show if you're just going to sit there and be miserable?" "I'm not being miserable," Harrison said, his jaw tightening. "I came here to have a conversation, not to be insulted." Jimmy rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, here we go, the tough guy act. You know what your problem is, Harrison? You take yourself way too seriously. You're an actor. You pretend to be other people for a living. It's not that deep." The audience was almost completely silent now. Even the band members looked uncomfortable. Harrison's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "I respect my work," Harrison said quietly, "and I respect the people I work with. Maybe you should try doing the same." Jimmy leaned forward, his smile gone now, replaced with something meaner. "Maybe you should try being grateful that anyone still wants to interview you. Let's be real, Harrison. You're not exactly box office gold anymore. When was the last time you opened a movie that didn't have Star Wars in the title? You're a nostalgia act, buddy. That's it." Harrison stared at him for a long moment. The silence stretched out, heavy and uncomfortable. "Are you finished?" he asked. "I'm just getting started," Jimmy replied. "You know what really bothers me about you? You come on these shows, you barely smile, you give one-word answers, and you act like we should all be honored that you showed up. Newsflash, we've had plenty of guests who are way more famous than you and actually know how to have fun. Having fun doesn't mean being disrespectful," Harrison said, his voice still controlled but with an edge to it now. Jimmy laughed again. "Disrespectful? I'm the one being disrespectful? You've been sitting there with that grumpy look on your face since you walked out here. You think the audience wants to watch someone who clearly doesn't want to be here? They came to be entertained, not to watch you sulk." "I'm not sulking," Harrison said firmly. "I'm responding to your questions, or at least I was, until you decided to turn this into some kind of attack." "Attack?" Jimmy's voice got louder. "I'm asking you honest questions that everyone's thinking. If you can't handle a little honesty, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Maybe you should just stay home and count your Star Wars money." A few people in the audience booed louder now. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone!" But Jimmy ignored it. Harrison took a deep breath. "I've done hundreds of interviews in my career. I've answered tough questions. I've laughed at jokes at my expense. But what you're doing right now isn't interviewing. It's just mean-spirited." "Mean-spirited?" Jimmy shot back. "You want to talk about mean-spirited? What about all those stories about you being difficult on set? What about all the directors who say you're impossible to work with? Should we talk about that?" "I don't know what stories you're referring to," Harrison said carefully. "But I can tell you that I show up prepared. I do my job and I treat people with respect." "Respect," Jimmy repeated mockingly. "That's funny coming from someone who barely acknowledges his fans. I've heard the stories, Harrison. People ask for autographs and you just walk past them like they don't exist." Harrison's face hardened. "That's not true. I'm happy to meet fans when it's appropriate and safe. but I also value my privacy and my family's safety. There's a difference between being accessible and being obligated to perform every moment of every day. There it is, Jimmy said, pointing at him. The excuses. You're too important, too private, too good for the little people who made you famous. That's not what I said, Harrison replied, his voice rising slightly for the first time. You're twisting my words. I'm not twisting anything. I'm just calling it like I see it. You're a washed-up actor who thinks he's still a big deal. The audience was booing loudly now. Someone yelled, "This isn't cool!" But Jimmy kept going. And you know what else? Jimmy continued. Your movies aren't even that good when you really think about it. Han Solo? Anyone could have played that. Indiana Jones? It's just a guy in a hat running around. You got lucky, that's all. Lucky that George Lucas needed someone, and you happened to be available. Harrison stood up slowly. The movement was so sudden that Jimmy actually leaned back in his chair. The entire studio went dead silent. I don't need to sit here and listen to this, Harrison said, his voice quiet but firm. Oh, what are you going to do? Jimmy asked, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. You're going to storm off? That's very professional. Harrison started removing his microphone. His movements were calm and deliberate. Professional would have been treating your guest with basic courtesy. Professional would have been asking real questions instead of trying to tear someone down for your own entertainment. Sit down, Harrison, Jimmy said, trying to laugh it off. Come on, I'm just joking around. Can't you take a joke? Those weren't jokes, Harrison said, placing the microphone on his chair. Jokes are supposed to be funny. What you did was just cruel. The audience started clapping. It started with just a few people, then more joined in, until most of the audience was applauding Harrison. Jimmy's face flushed red. Are you seriously going to walk off my show? Do you know how pathetic that makes you look? Harrison turned to face him one last time. No, Jimmy, it makes me look like someone who knows when to walk away from a bad situation. You should try it sometime. This is my show. Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. You can't just leave. Watch me, Harrison said simply. He turned toward the exit. Jimmy stood up from his desk, his face twisted in anger and embarrassment. Fine, go ahead and leave. We didn't want you here anyway. You're a has-been. Nobody cares about you anymore. Harrison stopped walking. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around, might say something else. But instead, he just shook his head slightly and continued toward the exit. The audience was on their feet now, still clapping, some of them cheering for Harrison. A few people were shouting at Jimmy, telling him he'd gone too far. Sit down, Jimmy yelled at the audience. All of you, sit down. This is ridiculous. He's the one being unprofessional, not me. But nobody sat down. If anything, the applause got louder. Jimmy's producer rushed onto the stage, trying to calm things down, trying to get Jimmy to stop talking. But Jimmy pushed past him, still yelling, You're all crazy. I was just doing my job. I was just trying to make good television. Harrison reached the edge of the stage. One of the stagehands offered him a hand down, which he accepted with a polite nod. Even in that moment, walking away from one of the most disastrous interviews in television history, he maintained his composure. Behind him, Jimmy was spiraling. Fine, leave. See if I care. We'll get someone better, someone who actually appreciates being here, someone who isn't a self-important, boring, washed up. The producer finally managed to cut Jimmy's microphone. The sudden silence was jarring. You could see Jimmy's mouth still moving, still yelling, but no sound came out. The audience continued clapping, and some of them started chanting Harrison's name. Harrison disappeared through the exit, and with him went any chance of salvaging the show. The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Jimmy's face as the reality of what just happened started to sink in. The arrogance, the smugness, it all drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. The audience was still on their feet, still applauding, but now it felt less like support for Harrison and more like a condemnation of Jimmy. Every clap was a judgment. Every cheer was a reminder that Jimmy had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Jimmy tried to smile, tried to make a joke about it, but his microphone was still off. His producer was in his ear, probably telling him they had to go to commercial, had to cut away before this got any worse. But the damage was done. In the span of less than 10 minutes, Jimmy Kimmel had managed to turn what should have been a pleasant interview into a complete disaster. He'd insulted one of Hollywood's most respected actors, questioned his talent, mocked his career, and shown a level of disrespect that shocked everyone watching. And Harrison Ford, for his part, had handled it with the kind of dignity and class that made it clear exactly who the real professional was. From the moment Jimmy made that first cutting remark about Harrison's career, the tone had shifted. Harrison had tried to keep things civil, had tried to answer honestly without escalating the situation. He'd shown patience when Jimmy questioned his relevance, restraint when Jimmy called him a nostalgia act, and composure when Jimmy suggested he was difficult to work with. But there's only so much disrespect a person can take, regardless of how famous they are or how thick their skin might be. When Jimmy started attacking his professionalism, when he suggested that Harrison was ungrateful and washed up, something had to give. The breaking point came when Jimmy dismissed Harrison's entire career as luck, when he suggested that anyone could have played those iconic roles. That wasn't just insulting Harrison's work, it was dismissing decades of craft, preparation, and dedication. It was reducing a legendary career to nothing more than being in the right place at the right time. Harrison had every right to defend himself, to argue back, to match Jimmy's energy, but instead, he chose the more powerful option. He simply left. No yelling, no name-calling, no stooping to Jimmy's level. He just stood up, removed his microphone, and walked away. And that choice, that decision to remove himself from a toxic situation rather than engage with it, made the strongest statement possible. The audience understood it immediately. That's why they stood and applauded. Not because Harrison was being dramatic or making a scene, but because he was demonstrating self-respect. He was showing that there's a limit to what anyone should tolerate, even in the name of publicity or promotion. Jimmy's reaction only reinforced how right Harrison was to leave. Instead of recognizing that he'd gone too far, instead of apologizing or trying to smooth things over, Jimmy doubled down. He yelled. He called Harrison names. He tried to paint himself as the victim. He showed the audience exactly who he really was when his ego was bruised. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. On one side, you had Harrison Ford, calm and collected even in the face of repeated insults, choosing dignity over drama. On the other side, you had Jimmy Kimmel, spiraling out of control, unable to accept that he'd created the problem in the first place. Throughout the entire disaster, Harrison never raised his voice beyond that one moment when he stood up. He never insulted Jimmy back. He never tried to humiliate him the way Jimmy had tried to humiliate Harrison. He simply stated facts. Those weren't jokes. Jokes are supposed to be funny. What you did was just cruel. Simple, direct, and absolutely true. Even Jimmy's own audience turned on him. These were people who had come to see his show, who presumably liked him enough to spend their evening in his studio. But when push came to shove, when they were forced to witness someone being genuinely mistreated, they sided with the guest over the host. That says everything you need to know about how far over the line Jimmy went. This wasn't a case of a sensitive guest who couldn't take a joke. This was a case of a host who forgot that there's a difference between playful teasing and actual meanness. The moment kept getting worse for Jimmy, even after Harrison left. Standing there, microphone cut, watching his audience applaud someone else, someone who had just walked off his show, must have been humiliating. But it was a humiliation entirely of his own making. He'd started the interview with one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood history sitting across from him. He'd had the opportunity to have a genuine conversation, to ask interesting questions, to give his audience an entertaining and insightful segment. Instead, he chose to be antagonistic. He chose to belittle and mock. He chose ego over entertainment. And in doing so, he handed Harrison Ford the moral high ground on a silver platter. Because here's the thing about respect. In the entertainment industry, it's earned through decades of consistent work, through treating people well, through showing up and doing the job even when it's difficult. Harrison Ford has that respect. He's earned it through a career spanning over 50 years, through dozens of films, through working with some of the best directors and actors in the business. Jimmy, in contrast, seemed to think that having his own show gave him the right to treat anyone however he wanted. He seemed to believe that being the host meant he could say whatever crossed his mind without consequences. He forgot, or maybe never understood, that respect goes both ways. When Harrison said, "I respect my work, and I respect the people I work with. Maybe you should try doing the same," he wasn't just defending himself. He was pointing out the fundamental difference between their approaches. Harrison shows up with respect for the process, for his colleagues, for the audience. Jimmy, at least in that moment, showed respect for no one but himself. The walk-off wasn't planned. Harrison didn't come to the show looking for a confrontation. You could see it in how he tried to de-escalate multiple times, how he attempted to answer questions seriously even as they became more hostile. But eventually, staying would have meant accepting treatment that no one should accept. Some people might wonder why Harrison didn't just laugh it off, why he didn't play along with what Jimmy seemed to think was just edgy humor. The answer is simple. Because it wasn't funny. and pretending it would have been dishonest. Jimmy kept saying he was just joking, that Harrison couldn't take a joke. But humor requires wit, timing, and most importantly, it requires that both people are in on it. What Jimmy was doing wasn't humor. It was mockery, disguised as humor, insults wrapped in the pretense of comedy. Real comedy, the kind that works in interviews, comes from a place of affection and mutual respect. It's possible to tease someone, to poke fun at them, without making them feel small. Great talk show hosts know how to find that balance. They know how to make their guests laugh at themselves without making them feel attacked. Jimmy lost that balance, if he ever had it to begin with. Every comment was designed to diminish Harrison, to make him seem less relevant, less talented, less worthy of respect. And when Harrison didn't play along, when he pushed back with calm dignity, Jimmy got angry. That anger revealed the truth of the situation. If Jimmy had really been joking, if his intentions had been good, he would have backed off the moment he realized Harrison wasn't comfortable. Instead, he escalated. He got meaner, more personal, more insulting. The comment about Harrison being a has-been, about nobody caring about him anymore, was particularly telling. It showed that Jimmy was no longer even pretending to interview. He was lashing out, trying to hurt Harrison because his ego couldn't handle being contradicted. And through it all, Harrison maintained his composure. Even when Jimmy was yelling at him, even when Jimmy was calling him names, Harrison didn't respond in kind. He just stated his position clearly and left. That's the kind of strength that comes from genuine confidence. Harrison doesn't need to prove himself to Jimmy Kimmel or anyone else. His work speaks for itself. His reputation speaks for itself. He knows who he is and what he's accomplished. And no amount of petty insults from a talk show host can change that. The audience reaction proved that they understood this too. They weren't applauding because they felt sorry for Harrison. They were applauding because they respected his decision to refuse mistreatment. They were acknowledging that he'd done the right thing, the brave thing, by walking away. In a world where celebrities are often expected to endure all kinds of treatment in the name of publicity, where they're supposed to smile and nod no matter what's said to them, Harrison's walk-off was a reminder that dignity matters more than appearances. He could have stayed. He could have gritted his teeth and gotten through the rest of the interview. He could have played nice, laughed off the insults, and left the audience thinking everything was fine, but that would have been a lie. And it would have sent the message that Jimmy's behavior was acceptable. By leaving, Harrison sent a different message. That there are limits, that respect matters, and that no amount of fame or success obligates anyone to tolerate abuse. The fact that Jimmy's own audience supported this decision, that they turned against their own host in support of the guest, shows just how badly Jimmy miscalculated. He thought he was being edgy, provocative, entertaining. He thought his audience would enjoy watching him take down a Hollywood legend. Instead, they were appalled, because most people understand the difference between good-natured ribbing and actual cruelty. Most people can recognize when someone has crossed the line from entertainment into bullying, and most people, when forced to choose, will side with the person being mistreated over the person doing the mistreating. Jimmy's desperate attempts to regain control as Harrison left only made things worse, yelling at the audience to sit down, insisting that he was just doing his job, calling Harrison unprofessional. All of it just dug the hole deeper. Every word out of his mouth after Harrison stood up was another nail in the coffin of his credibility. If he'd stopped, if he'd let Harrison leave with dignity and tried to move on to the next segment, he might have salvaged something. But his ego wouldn't let him. He had to have the last word, had to try to paint himself as the wrong party, had to convince everyone that he was right and Harrison was wrong. The audience wasn't buying it. His producer wasn't buying it. And everyone watching at home definitely wasn't buying it. What made the whole situation even more painful to watch was how unnecessary it all was. Harrison is known for being a thoughtful interview subject. He might not be the most effusive or enthusiastic guest, but he's professional, he's honest, and he has interesting stories to tell. A skilled interviewer could have drawn out fascinating insights about his career, his approach to acting, his experiences working on iconic films. Instead, Jimmy chose confrontation. He chose to treat the interview as an opportunity to tear someone down rather than learn from them. He chose his own ego over his audience's entertainment, and in the end, he was left standing on his own stage, microphone cut, audience against him, looking at the exit where one of Hollywood's most respected actors had just walked out on him. That image, that moment of Jimmy standing there realizing what he'd done, perfectly captured the entire disaster. He'd had everything, the guests, the audience, the opportunity, and he'd thrown it all away because he couldn't resist being cruel. Harrison Ford, meanwhile, walked out of that studio with his dignity intact and his reputation enhanced. He'd shown millions of people watching that he won't compromise his self-respect for anyone or anything. He demonstrated that real strength isn't about matching aggression with aggression, but about knowing when to remove yourself from a bad situation. The 34 seconds that Jimmy had to make things right, to apologize, to change course, he spent making things worse. 34 seconds where he could have recognized he'd gone too far and course corrected. Instead, he used those seconds to prove Harrison's point about his behavior being cruel rather than funny. And that's the story of how Jimmy Kimmel's ego destroyed what should have been a simple, pleasant interview, and how Harrison Ford walked away from it all with grace, dignity, and the respect of everyone watching.